Section 4 of an address to free colored Americans. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Sonali Punja. An address to free colored Americans, issued by Anti-Slavery Convention of American Women. Section 4. Another subject which is worthy of your consideration is the consistency of abstaining as abolitionists from the use of slave labor products as far as is practical. The conviction that this is a duty is gaining ground among the friends of emancipation, and we doubt not that the self-denial which it will probably demand on our part will arouse the conscience of the slaveholder by demonstrating that we are willing to sacrifice interest and convenience to principle. To the toil-worn slave, it will minister unspeakable consolation to hear, while bending over the rice or sugar or cotton field and writhing under the lash, that his friends at the North feel a sympathy so deep for his sufferings that they cannot partake of the proceeds of his unrequited toil. Think you not it would cheer his agonized heart and impart a renewed strength to endure his affliction, to know that his blood was not spilt for the gratification of those who are trying to obtain for him the blessing of liberty? We entreat you to give this evidence of your love to those who have emphatically fallen among thieves. Then, although you cannot pour the wine and the oil into their corporeal wounds, nor dress with mollifying ointment the bloody gash of the driver's whip, you may minister to their mental comfort and soothe their broken hearts. Let it not be imagined that the slaves of the South are destitute of intelligence or ignorant of what is going at the North. Many a noble mind is writhing there in bondage and panting for deliverance, as the hart panted after the water brooks. Mr. Good, in the legislature of Virginia in 1832, when he brought in the resolution which produced the celebrated debate in that body, earnestly pressed upon the House the effect of what was passing among the minds of the slaves themselves. Many of them he represented as wise and intelligent men, constantly engaged in reflection, informed of all that was occurring, and having their attention fixed upon the legislature. And we have been informed on good authority that a slave in one of the southern states, one of those whose soul never bowed to the yoke of bondage, said that himself and his fellow sufferers spent many a midnight hour in discussing the probable results of the abolition movements, and were firmly persuaded that their redemption from bondage would finally be effected, though they knew not exactly by what means it would be accomplished. Every fugitive slave who is carried back bears to his unhappy countrymen an account of all that is doing. Every free man who falls into the ruthless fangs of the kidnapper spreads information at the South of all our efforts for the abolition of slavery, and we put it to any one of ourselves whether, if we were wasting our energies and toiling in cheerless bondage, it would not be some alleviation to know that there were those who loved us so tenderly and felt for us so keenly that they would not participate in the luxuries which were the fruit of our extorted and unrequited labor. It has been urged, and with some plausibility, that the use of the products of slave labor is one of the little things connected with the great cause of abolition. Admitting it to be little, is it therefore unimportant? Does not the reproof of our Redeemer exactly apply to this case, when in speaking of the tithe of mint, anise and cumin, and the weightier matters of the law, he says, "This ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone." But however small it may appear, it involves a great principle, because it really encourages the traffic in human flesh by offering to the slaveholder an inducement to perpetuate the system of oppression from which he derives his unrighteous gains. Another hackneyed objection is that our abstaining will not lessen the quantity grown, and other consumers will soon be found. With this, we have nothing to do. We might, on the same premises, purchase and hold slaves, because if we do not, others will. No doubt much inconvenience and some privation must be endured, but this will be continually decreasing as West India productions will furnish a substitute. In some instances, the use of cotton cannot perhaps be avoided by the poor, but still much may be done, and those of us who have made the experiment can testify that our abstinence has strengthened us for the work we are engaged in, and that there is a sweet feeling of conscious integrity that gladdens our heart. I will wash mine hands in innocency. So will I compass thine altar, O Lord. In proportion as the demand for free labor products increases, the supply will increase, and the greater the quantity of such articles which is thrown into the market, the more their price will lessen. Besides, allowing the labor of a slave for 6 years to produce all the various slave-grown products which anyone may use during the course of his life, would not he who was so occupied be in effect the slave of such a one during the time he was thus employed? This is a solemn and affecting consideration, and can be most correctly weighed when we are on our knees before God. It is a matter between him and every individual soul, and he alone can settle it. We believe it was the want of that principle which we have been endeavoring to inculcate, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself," that gave birth to the scheme of expatriating our colored brethren to Africa. We do not design to attribute unhallowed motives to all who engaged in this crusade against the rights and happiness of free American citizens. Many, we believe, like our beloved brother Gerrit Smith, embarked in this enterprise without examining the principles of the society, deluded by the false though plausible assertion that the colored man could not rise in his native land to an equality with his white compatriots, and desirous to do them all the good that circumstances admitted. Nevertheless, we are constrained to believe what you have so often asserted and so keenly felt, that the colonization society originated in hatred to the free people of color. We rejoice that you early detected the fallacy and the iniquity of the scheme, that you arose in the dignity of conscious rights, in the majesty of moral power, in the boldness of injured innocence, and exposed the cruelty and unrighteousness of a project which, had it been carried fully into execution, would have robbed America of some of her best and most valuable citizens, and exiled from our shores those whose hearts are bound to their country by no common bonds, even by the holy bonds of sympathy for their countrymen in chains. A project which would have poured upon the shores of pagan Africa a broken-hearted population prepared by mental suffering to sink into a premature grave. A band of exiles who had been exposed against their judgment and their will to all the nameless trials which belonged to the settlement of colonial establishments, and all that anguish which must have been endured under the reflection that they had been banished from the land of their birth, merely to gratify an unhallowed prejudice when their country needed their services, when there was abundant room in the land, though not in the hearts of their countrymen. We admire your noble and uncompromising resistance to this scheme of oppression, and your children will thank you to the latest generation. We honor you for the undaunted and generous resolutions which you passed soon after the colonization society came into existence, when the spontaneous language of your hearts was embodied in the following sentiments. Whereas our ancestors, not of choice, were the first successful cultivators of the wilds of America, we, their descendants, feel ourselves entitled to participate in the blessings of her luxuriant soil, which their blood and sweat manured, and that any measure or system of measures having a tendency to banish us from her bosom would not only be cruel, but would be in direct violation of those principles which have been the boast of this republic. Resolved that we view with deep abhorrence the unmerited stigma attempted to be cast upon the reputation of the free people of color by the promoters of this measure, that they are a dangerous and useless part of the community, when in the state of disfranchisement in which they live, in the hour of danger they cease to remember their wrongs and rallied round the standard of their country, resolved that we will never separate ourselves from the slave population in this country. They are our brethren by the ties of consanguinity, of suffering, and of wrong, and we feel that there is more virtue in suffering privations with them than enjoying fancied advantages for a season. Resolved that, having the strongest confidence in the justice of God and in the philanthropy of the free states, we cheerfully submit our destinies to the guidance of Him who suffers not a sparrow to fall to the ground without His special providence. We praise the Lord that while the white man slumbered over the wrongs of his enslaved countrymen, or stretched out his hands to rivet the bondman's chains, or to thrust his brother from his side, your sympathy and your compassion, like that of the beneficent Redeemer, was wakeful and active, and called forth from the depths of your souls the following soul-stirring appeal. Where, oh, where were the hearts of Americans that they responded not to your call? We humbly, respectfully, and fervently entreat and beseech your disapprobation of the plan of colonization now offered by the American Society for colonizing the free people of color of the United States. Here in the city of Philadelphia, where the voice of the suffering sons of Africa was first heard, where was first commenced the work of abolition on which heaven has smiled, for it could have success only from the great Master. Let not a purpose be assisted which will stay the cause of the entire abolition of the slavery in the United States, and which may defeat it altogether, which proffers to those who do not ask for them what it calls benefits, but which they consider injuries, and which must ensure to the multitude whose prayers can only reach you through us, misery, sufferings, and perpetual slavery. Nor can we pass by unnoticed the noble conduct of our sister in Ohio, who, when her father proposed to bring her to the North, where she might pass for a white woman and settle upon her a comfortable independence, replied that she would never forsake her people, that she would rather suffer with them than enjoy all the advantages he promised. We do homage to the virtue which prefer to endure affliction with the oppressed rather than bask in the sunshine of worldly prosperity and popular favor. But for the dignified opposition which you manifested, but for the developments which you made of the real designs and fearful consequences of colonization, your guilty country would probably have added to her manifold transgressions against the descendants of Africa the transcendent crime of banishing from her shores those whom she has deeply injured, and whom she is bound by every law of justice and of mercy to cherish with peculiar tenderness. but for your virtuous and uncompromising hostility to the colonization society, a portion of our countrymen might never have been disabused of the idle and fallacious expectation that this scheme would cure the moral evil of slavery and put an end to the horrible slave traffic carried on the coast of Africa. You saw that the root of the evil was in our own land, and that the expatriation of the best part of our colored population, so far from abolishing slavery, would render the condition of the enslaved tenfold more hopeless. You saw that the only means of destroying the slave trade was to destroy the spirit of slavery. And how just have been your conclusions, let the following testimonies declare. We extract from an official communication to the Secretary of the Navy by Captain Joseph J. Nicholson of the Navy. The slave trade within the last 3 years has seriously injured the colony. Not only has it diverted the industry of the natives, but it has effectually cut off the communication with the interior. The war parties, being in the habit of plundering and kidnapping for slaves all whom they meet, whether parties to the war or not, the daring of the slaver increases with the demand for slaves, which could not of late be supplied by the usual means, and within a year 4 slave factories have been established almost within sight of the colony. End of section 4. Recording by Sonali Punja.